Many people say that they were glad to be born. They may say this, but can we trust that they were accurately considering the things they needed to come to that judgment? I'm not quite sure they are. I've already gone over in previous videos why I think that those who are glad to be born suffer from a kind of Stockholm syndrome, and why the judgment that you're glad to be born isn't a good reason to create new people. In this video though, I want to explore if we can trust this judgment at all. Let's get stuck in. In the paper To Be or Not to Have Been, Defective Counterfactual Reasoning About One's Own Existence by David Benatar, he says the following: the fact that there are people who are glad they came into being has been cited as evidence that, at least for those people, existence must be a benefit. In response, I've suggested that people's preferences in this area are profoundly unreliable indicators of what is actually better. One explanation for this is that those who declare a preference for having come into existence tend not to have really considered the counterfactual case, the scenario in which they never come into existence. If both options have not been truly considered, any ranking of one over the other is not an appropriately informed preference, and thus cannot be taken as a reliable indicator of what is actually best. So what could these errors be that are hindering people in accurately considering the counterfactual where they never came into existence? Well, there are some conceptual ones and there are some psychological ones. Let's cover the conceptual ones first. Again, from the same paper, Benatar says this: the mistake made by the cheery people who think life is a benefit is that they make the wrong comparison. Rather than comparing the scenario in which a person exists with another scenario in which he does not exist, they compare the benefits with harms of the person who exists. In this latter comparison, if the benefits outweigh the costs, either in sheer quantity or via some distributive principle, then they judge the life to be preferable to never having come into existence. This, however, is the way to assess how good a life is. It is not the way one can judge whether existence is better than never existing. The wrong comparison is made, and all those lives in which the benefits outweigh the costs are thought to be lives that are preferable to never existing. In this passage, we can tease out a few of the conceptual reasons for why people make this mistake. The first is that a judgment that coming into existence is a benefit is just assumed, which I believe is a likely mistaken assumption. The second, and it's related to the first, is that instead of comparing coming into existence with never coming into existence, they compare the benefits of coming into existence with the harms of coming into existence. The third, and this is more empirical, is that they're very likely mistaken in thinking that the goods in life outweigh the bads. Let's go through these one by one. The first is a relatively fundamental one and probably needs a whole video of its own, but we can address it briefly here. Coming into existence is widely, and I think uncritically, seen as better than never coming into existence. This judgment will bias people towards judging that they are glad to have been born. Coming into existence, however, is not a benefit, in my view, because it carries no advantage over never existing, but it does carry a disadvantage. To understand this, let's begin with something else Benatar covers in this paper. Bad things happen only to those who come into existence. The never existent suffer no harm. Although it is true that it is also only existers who enjoy benefits, there is an asymmetry between harms and benefits, such that existence holds no advantage over never existing. The asymmetry is this: although the absence of harm is good, even if that good is not enjoyed by anyone, the absence of a benefit is not bad unless there is somebody for whom this absence is a deprivation. Given this asymmetry, the harms of existence are real disadvantages over never existing, whereas the benefits of existence, although good to the exister, are not real advantages over never existing. Benatar does go on to defend this asymmetry in his later book, Better Never to Have Been: The Harm of Coming into Existence, but this video isn't the place to cover the details of that. I'll make a whole separate video on that, and if you want to check out that book, it's linked in the description. To help convey understanding of what Benatar is trying to explain here, consider this analogy that he lays out in that book. Sick is prone to regular bouts of illness. Fortunately for him, he is also so constituted that he recovers quickly. Healthy lacks the capacity for quick recovery, but he never gets sick. It is bad for sick that he gets sick, and it is good for him that he recovers quickly. It is good that healthy never gets sick, but it is not bad that he lacks the capacity to heal speedily. The capacity for quick recovery, although good for sick, is not a real advantage over healthy. This is because the absence of that capacity is not bad for healthy. This, in turn, is because the absence of that capacity is not a deprivation for healthy. Healthy is not worse off than he would have been had he had the recuperative powers of sick. Sick is not better off than healthy in any way, even though sick is better off than he himself would have been had he lacked the capacity for rapid recovery. In short, the reason that coming into existence isn't better than never coming into existence is because an individual doesn't stand to gain anything from coming into existence. existence. The good things that we value as existing individuals are only of value to us because we exist. But also, because we exist, we suffer harms, and those are almost always considerable, which we'll touch on a bit more later. This brings us to the second conceptual mistake, that instead of comparing coming into existence with never coming into existence, people compare the benefits of coming into existence and the harms of coming into existence. This is likely done because we're making the assessment from the point of view of someone who already exists, and it's hard for us to detach ourselves from this standpoint. And it's understandable. We've never experienced never coming into existence. We have no internal reference point for comparing non-existence with existence. We value the goods in life as someone who exists, and we're advantaged by their presence given that we exist. And it's difficult for us to imagine ourselves never existing, and thus no one being in existence to need or desire these things that we value. As such, when people think about not existing, they are probably thinking about exiting existence rather than never coming into it. As such, we view the non-existence of these goods as a loss, rather than us simply never coming to be and not existing to value them. Just like the non-existent child that we could create right now, but whom doesn't exist to care that they are not created. Benatar explains this kind of reasoning more here. To say that another life qualitatively like one's own is not worth starting is not necessarily to say that one's own life is not worth continuing, nor is it to undermine the value that one's life has to oneself. Of course, it is to say that it would have been better had one's life not started, but that is only threatening if one contemplates one's never existing from the perspective of one's existing. Put another way, it is to consider a future life decision about one's own life from a present life perspective. But that is a mistake. It is to fail to consider truly the counterfactual case where one does not yet exist, and thus has no interest whatsoever in coming into existence. And he found this kind of reasoning present in the responses he got to a questionnaire he himself put out about this matter, which you can read more about in the paper itself, to be or not to have been. He says this: examining people's explanations why they are happy to have come into existence, we find evidence that they have not genuinely considered the counterfactual case. For instance, many people explain their preference for having come into existence by saying, I feel happy, I enjoy life, or life is happy and joyful. Other comments in the same vein were, my life is in most respects good and fulfilling, I am usually happy about myself and my life, I have everything that I feel I need to be content, and I have had a damn good time and have been fortunate in my choice of profession. Benatar goes on to explain that they are implicitly claims that the benefits of living outweigh the harms of living, not that existence is preferable to non-existence. A similar mistake is made by those who explain their preference for having come into existence by the opportunity this gave them to have experiences which would otherwise not have been had, or to do things which would otherwise not have been done, to experience life. I am extremely curious about what goes on around me. Sight, smell, taste, sound, touch, emotion, knowledge, thought. Without being in existence, you would not know how life would be and what the earth looks like. Otherwise, I would miss everything. Life, love, experiences, South Africa. If I didn't, I would not have met all the wonderful friends I have now, because I would like to make something of myself. And I am glad I came into existence due to the fact that I can have an education and to study everything. The third mistake, and again this is more of an empirical one, is that those who judge the goods in their life to outweigh the bads are, in my view, likely mistaken. I won't go fully into it here, but there is good reason to think that our lives are actually much worse than we tend to judge them to be. I go over this more in detail in my video, Why Your Life is Worse Than You Think. It's linked in the description for anyone who wants to watch that. There are some other reasons to think that people are not accurately considering the counterfactual case when they never came into existence. And these are less conceptual ones and more psychological ones. Humans are prone to all sorts of psychological biases that would bias us against giving an honest consideration to the counterfactual where we never came into existence. It seems plausible to me that these biases are probably present in many cases where people are trying to consider this counterfactual. And this is because considering that counterfactual implicitly accepts that it could be the possibility that it would have been better had one never come into existence. These biases include status quo bias, confirmation bias, cultural bias, an evolutionary bias towards wanting to reproduce, and motivated reasoning. And I'm sure there are many others as well. There will be all sorts of biases counting against humans giving this counterfactual an honest assessment. In summary, there are both conceptual and psychological reasons why it is difficult for us to honestly and dispassionately consider the counterfactual of us never coming into existence. Our own non-existence is just something that many of us struggle a lot trying to think about. It's like very large numbers or the distant suffering of individuals that are very different to us. These are things that are just not intuitive for us to think about. This means that the judgment someone may have that they are glad to have been born cannot serve as reliable evidence that existence actually is preferable to never existing. Someone being glad to have been born at most can be seen as them simply being content at this specific point in time with the fact that they were born. This, in my eyes, doesn't provide post hoc justification for their parents creating them, and more importantly, it doesn't provide pre hoc justification for them creating someone else. As Benatar closes the paper, that many people are glad to have come into existence is not a good reason for bringing others into existence, especially where the preference for existing is the result of defective reasoning. By exposing a common shortcoming in human reasoning, they provide an opportunity for correcting our defects. Just as it helps, for example, to know of the human propensity to obey authority because we are then better equipped to resist this disposition where appropriate, so it can help to know of our tendency to ignore the counterfactual case in our judgments about whether existence is preferable to never existing. This in turn can facilitate a more critical approach to procreation. If those who are glad to have come into existence realized how unreliable their preference was, then they would have a reason to be more critical of their belief that they bestow some great benefit on their children by having them. Now, before we close, it might be said that someone cannot be wrong about whether it was better for them to come into existence, because their being glad to be born is sufficient to say it was better for them. They're the only one that can make such a judgment about their life. We need to remember, though, that someone being glad to be born isn't the same thing as it being better to have come into existence. If someone is reasoning under the pressure of strong psychological biases, they can be glad that something happened to them that it would have actually been better if it had not happened. If you want to go more in detail into this, then you can check out my video, An Antinatalist Analysis of the Glad to be Born. But if you don't want to watch that whole video and you need some reference point, then you can just look at the cases of what is colloquially called Stockholm Syndrome. Anyway, let me know if I have missed anything. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one.